Okay, our next speakers are from the American Red Cross, if I'm not mistaken.
Sort of.
Yes. Emily and Stef, please welcome our speakers.
So you're actually getting two speakers for the price of one. Seth from Stamen, who actually developed Possum for us, joined State of the Map at the last minute. So we're going to pull him in to add a little bit of his perspective as well. So Possum, Portable OpenStreetMap. I'll talk a little bit about why we, the American Red Cross, needed to develop this as a tool and the environments where we use it. We'll talk about our philosophy for the design, how it works, and where we're going from here. So I think a lot of people in this room are probably familiar with the Missing Maps project, but just in case, this is a program that started 2 years ago as a collaboration between the American Red Cross, the British Red Cross, HOT, and MSF UK. There's since been a number of organizations that have joined since. But a lot of us were working on GIS or mapping in disaster response contexts, and we found that doing hot activations and mapping for response is fantastic, but we need maps before a disaster hits. In OpenStreetMap, a lot of the places where we're working, a lot of the most vulnerable communities still aren't really very well mapped. So we started this project with the goal of mapping 20 million people by 2017. And we do this in 2 steps. Firstly, we host mapathons and we engage with digital volunteers to help them trace satellite imagery into OpenStreetMap. Secondly, we work with our local organizations, Red Cross, MSF, et cetera, to help community volunteers who are actually on the ground and in the field to learn about why mapping is important and help them figure out what in their community is a priority to put in the map. We bring technology, we train them, and we help them get started. And then thirdly, once base mapping is done, we work on developing maps and analysis and other things like that and helping them understand how they can incorporate this to plan resilience activities or conduct other programs. So in the past 2 years, we've actually surpassed our goal of 20 million people with the help of 12,000 digital volunteers. This involved over 300 mapathons. This is looking at total for missing maps, not just American Red Cross. And we've been doing this all around the world. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the remote work that we've been doing, but people might be less familiar with all of the field work that goes into this. So even before the Missing Maps project, the American Red Cross has been using filled papers and GPS devices to do base mapping, to put where our projects are located actually on the map. This is fantastic, but there's a lot of time required to get data from field papers back into OSM, and we found that it's not always the best tool for the job. If we're looking to survey every building in an area and look to answer the same 4 questions of what's the building condition, what's the material, or something like that, it's more difficult to get consistent answers, and we spent a lot of time trying to clean up data for spellings, trying to match key value pairs so that they're going into OSM accurately. So about a year and a half ago, we developed OpenMapKit with spatial dev. We wanted to take the functionality of ODK and the ability to have consistent surveys, but add in a way to easily tag this into OSM. So what it looks like, it's a basic Android app. You go through ODK, but there'll be a launch OpenMapKit component where it shows your GPS location and the buildings around you. And then you can simply tap on a building and then swipe through the form, building equals residential, et cetera, and go through. So this launched about a year and a half ago. We used it in Dhaka, Bangladesh, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ecuador, Colombia, and a variety of other places. And it's worked really well for us in general. This is available on the Android or the Google Play Store. There's also full documentation available on the website, openmapkit.org. So it's really easy to set up and use on your own. I know there's a lot of OSM editing tools out there. At the time when we were working on this, we felt like none of them really meet our needs. So we developed it for our purposes. We felt pretty comfortable about our tech stack. So a year ago, we wanted to focus on scaling up in a big way and doing a lot more community engagement in the field. So we were awarded a grant to map all the villages within 15 kilometers of the borders between Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This was an effort to update the map for the border regions of the areas that were affected by Ebola. It was really difficult to get a basic map of where villages were in the Ebola outbreak, and it's very hard to do contact tracing without that. So we wanted to go in, update OSM, and get some better field data. This was a massive project. We found out eventually, once we'd done the project, we learned there were 6,000 villages and communities that we'd gone to. Initially, we thought there was maybe between 3 and 5. It's an area roughly the size of Switzerland, and we had 4 months to do this, using about 100 volunteers on motorbikes. Once we started this project, we had to kind of take a step back and think about, okay, these are the tools we're currently using. These are their use cases. Is this appropriate? And if not, how are we going to build this out to work with this environment? It's an incredibly difficult region to be mapping in. This is a good road, believe it or not. And that's wet season. This is dry season. This is one of our volunteers in the field. This is the bridge that he's crossing. So it's incredibly difficult to move across this area. Most of the region in the border areas doesn't have cell phone connectivity. And our volunteers were often out there for days or even weeks at a time where we wouldn't be able to physically get to them. What we found is that humanitarians are making increasing use of mobile data collection and cloud-based tools, and that's fantastic, but we're also using them in increasingly remote areas, and sometimes that can be a problem. OpenMapKit works really well, or all of these tools work really well until they don't. And if we need the internet to make a form, to make a field papers atlas, to upload data, to edit OSM, all of those things, suddenly if the power goes down and we don't have internet, there's nothing we can do. Or there's a fire with the conference Wi-Fi. It happens here at home. This is a photo from Rwanda where we were planning to use OpenMapKit, and then the Nepal earthquake happened. We weren't able to generate MB tiles, or maybe we were just having our own technical problems, and we ended up having to stay up all night long and tape field papers together by headlamp because we weren't able to get OpenMapKit up and running. So we have backup solutions, and that's great, but for an area like West Africa, we wanted to be able to actually change things on the fly. So this is Possum. It runs on about a $300 piece of hardware. That's an Intel NUC. And I'll let you talk through what's on there.
Okay. So this is one of them here, and it's actually plugged in and broadcasting an access point called Possum. The password is awesome possum, and it's on a future slide. You guys can connect to it, and you can get the dashboard and browse around field papers. You could make some field papers of the university area. If you want, and you have OpenMapKit installed, you could do some surveying. You can also do some OpenStreetMap editing. And because we don't have any wireless here, and that's broadcasting, and it's not connected to the LAN, it's completely disconnected. So we wanted something where we could run as much of the OpenStreetMap stack as possible in a field situation. And to be able to do it on hardware like this that we have control over, not necessarily a racked server. The other advantage of this is that you can run it off a car if you need to, which is pretty powerful. So here's a picture of Dale in Liberia. That's the Red Cross chapter headquarters, or one of the chapter headquarters in the background. And it's running off one of the land cruisers that's there. And he's sitting there making some edits and looking at the map and validating some data. And there's no cell coverage, there's no internet, there's nothing like that. So the basic gist of this is that we use a whole bunch of existing OSM tools that are out there, and it would be completely impossible to have done without all of you in the room and anybody watching at home and anybody you've talked to that's developed any of this stuff. It's completely building on the shoulders of giants. It's kind of amazing. I feel like to digress slightly, I feel like OSM is in an interesting place where we're starting to see third order effects, where there's the API, there are the tools that have been built on the API, and there have been all of these really interesting things made, and it's now possible to combine them in novel ways to affect change in West Africa and to solve problems that you didn't really know that could be solved by technology before, and you can do it because there are all of these different pieces that get tied together. So at the core, we pulled data from Overpass. So we pulled data from OpenStreetMap, and then we use Overpass to pull it into the OSM, the OSM export tool that Hot uses. We've got an adapted version of that. And that creates a little data packet that you can load onto a USB stick. I did that at the hotel last night. This has all of Brussels on it, and because I didn't see any network jacks here, I brought it on a USB stick, loaded it on, and and we actually did this at one point where we had a USB stick that needed to be prepared, digitally transferred to London, and then somebody got on a plane and ended up in Guinea a couple days later and loaded it on one of these devices. So we're really thinking about data as a logistics problem, and data as, I mean, it's really going back to SneakerNet and packet networks in the form of 18th century ships. So it's really interesting to look at data in that way. And all of the OSM tools are really great for pulling data downstream. You can create all sorts of derivative artifacts. You can create things like map tiles. You can create surveys. But if the data can't actually get back upstream, if it can't get merged into OpenStreetMap, it's really not any better than having all of these disparate databases that OpenStreetMap is trying to replace. So one of the other initial goals was to be able to get all of that data back in. To do that, I'm trying to remember what we have slide-wise. So to do that, you can make these edits offline. So it pulls an extract. So in this case, we've got Brussels on here. You can make changes to Brussels. And all of those local change sets occur using exactly the same software as OpenStreetMap.org. And they're diverging from edits that are happening on the internet at large. And then when the Red Cross team returns from a field deployment, actually, what do we have for? Oh yeah, so you can edit in ID or JOSM. Sorry, I'm kind of diverging from the slides a little bit. You didn't see that yet. So once all those edits have been made, we package up all of the change sets there, and we replay them against the main OSM. And we make sure that anything that conflicts with changes that happened elsewhere, for Brussels, that would be a problem. For West Africa, it turns out it's not. There aren't a whole lot of active mappers, particularly in the villages that they're operating in, which is why they're operating in them. So it is possible to run into conflicts, but the number of conflicts that occur are a lot smaller. So there's a really kind of convoluted workflow that I'm really proud of because it works. I'm not proud of it because it's pretty. That I'm not going to talk about. I can talk to you guys about it a little bit more in person, and we're also going to do a Birds of a Feather session at 4 this afternoon. I can't remember which room, but come look for us. We'll have one of these up again, and you can play with OpenMapKit and OpenDataKit and do some edits there. Yeah, so, right, so eventually those changes get synchronized back up, and you can go back out into the field with another set of changes. And we did this, I was in Ecuador with the Red Cross back in March, and we took an extract of the area that we were working in, and then went down there, and then came back, and then I needed to write the software. So overall, it was probably like a month and a half that we were disconnected from the main OSM. And within that, we, I think, had 350 change sets made by about 35 volunteers, and I think touched about 15,000 objects, and didn't run into a whole lot of merge conflicts, and I only made 2 mistakes when I merged it back in, so I was pretty happy with that. And they were easy enough to fix. Just going through and like, okay, the bounding box for this edit is completely wrong. I guess one of the nodes we didn't manage to renumber properly. Oh, so yeah, that's the other thing. That we talk about Possum being really good for uncertain environments. And West Africa in the rainy season is an uncertain environment. Turns out the Free University of Brussels is an uncertain environment when there's a fire in a server cabinet. And if you've ever experienced bad hotel Wi-Fi, it's the same thing. And if you've ever tried to do a workshop using bad hotel Wi-Fi, it's really painful. So we're discovering that Possum isn't about OpenStreetMap, and it isn't even really about the synchronization. It's about thinking about something where I have 2 of these riding around in my bag with me that can run all sorts of different software and can be repurposed for all sorts of different things. They could provide Wikipedia, they could provide material for a workshop so that you don't have to rely on really bad internet and have really positive experiences. If you're doing an edit-a-thon in a place that has really bad wireless, you can have people work really quickly against the local API and then synchronize it when you're done, or you could do that for other types of workshops. Starting to ramble here. What else should we talk about?
So just kind of stepping back a little bit. So basically the process is one of these gets ordered. You order one of these online. It shows up. You have to assemble some components. If you have trouble with that, Seth has offered to do this for you in exchange for baked goods. But basically we do an install the first time, boot it up, and then every time from that point forward, you just plug this into, you do a hot export, take your area, load it onto the Possum, and you're good to go. So we do our full stack of Red Cross operations on this. We have a mapping hub in Guinea that acts as our base of operations for West Africa. It actually doesn't have internet. It was going to cost something like $40,000 for 3 months of internet, so we said no thank you. And we run mapathons off of this. We do all of our field work off of it. So it's been fantastic. Speaks for itself. This tool is continually learning and growing. Possum is essentially glue that ties together a stack of other software. I learned recently that a possum and an opossum are two entirely different animals. We're also kind of actively trying to figure out, well, where do we go from here? So Seth came down to Ecuador. Was it Ecuador or Colombia? It was Ecuador. To try to take a look at what does this look like in the field from a developer perspective. Because if we're developing software that works for local community uses, we want to make sure that the developers actually get a chance to see what that looks like, so that we don't have a disconnect between where the software is being developed and where it's actually being used.
Let me jump in on that briefly. If you guys have ever experienced problems with field papers when you're trying to use it in the field, you can blame me for those, but I'm gonna say I didn't know, because I'm not one of those people that's actively using it in the field. So understanding how people are using it in the field is incredibly valuable. And if there are any tool developers out there, go out there, watch your users, find out how they're doing it, find out what breaks, find out what they're not telling you. It's kind of amazing.
Other directions that we're growing in, we're actually integrating, literally as we speak, we're working on integrating OpenDroneMap, so that we'll also be able to collect imagery, process that, do our edits off of that. So that'll be coming out in the upcoming weeks. In terms of how you can get this is documented on GitHub at the moment, and then we're building out more user-friendly documentation from here. West Africa as a project has been a complete sprint from start to finish, so we're just getting to the point where the fieldwork is done and we have a chance to think about how do we kind of think about making our tools more easily available publicly. So that's coming soon.
She said drones, so you can actually bring a drone in a Pelican case to wherever, fly it, process it, take one of these guys, and you've got imagery that you can trace in the field without ever having been connected to the internet. It's pretty awesome.
So we're very excited about this. And then again, just kind of going back to the point, we're super excited about Possum as a tool, but we also want to think about why we developed it. So we're continuing to engage with the community and think about, well, what are their needs? What does this look like? How do we make editing OSM more possible and more feasible for people who maybe don't have consistent Wi-Fi or don't have consistent electricity and stuff like that?
Before I just remembered a couple things that I wanted to say about OpenMapKit. So the tie into the previous OSM building editor talk. One of the things that's really important for the disaster risk reduction efforts in the humanitarian world is knowing what buildings are made out of, how large they are, and what quality they're in. So being able to see other ways of getting that data in is incredibly helpful. That's one of the things that OpenMapKit was originally built for, to be able to do surveys, to be able to do it really quickly, not to map new things necessarily. So as we were talking about this, we're like, oh, is OpenMapKit really only good for field situations for humanitarians? And I don't think it is. I think it's also really good for areas that have been extremely well mapped, but some parts of those areas have not been touched in maybe a year or so. So if you're looking to get involved in this and you want to experience this for yourself, I would highly encourage you to give it a shot and to create a form and to resurvey areas like downtown areas in smaller towns that you haven't visited in a while. And you can do that really quickly by preloading the data in. And what you're essentially doing is you're ground truthing your own data. But now that it's been a year later, 2 years later, things have changed. And you can just flip through and only make the changes that are there. So I think that OpenMapKit is a really valuable tool for for particularly the dense OSM communities, as well as the developing world.
Great. I think that's all we had. So if there's questions, happy to take them.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm sorry I'm going to be a bit critical, but that's me. I'm happy actually to see that in the POSSUM project you went from an initial bout of rampant, not invented here, to actually using the normal OpenStreetMap stack.
Where did we start with the non-invented here part?
The Node.js implementation of the API and all that kind of stuff, which was initially planned.
Oh, we're looking for lightweight solutions. So yeah.
Yeah, but you know, I can understand that. But there was no real communication with the developer community, talking about communities in OSM, and just the same with OpenMapKit. You say you weren't happy with what was available, but there was no communication into the developer community of OSM, and I continue to feel that this is the whole thing, that you're building on these pieces, but you're not actually asking people for their opinions on how things should work. For example, the synchronization back into OSM. There are multiple ways to doing it. Using GitHub conflict resolution to synchronize stuff back into OSM is just an awful hack, in my opinion.
It works, though.
It works. I believe that for 100 conflicts, but not for 10,000.
Well, we're not trying to end up in situations where we end up in 10,000. I think that your criticism about not engaging the developer communities is actually right on. And I would not necessarily defend, but I would submit that one of the reasons for that is, if you talk to Emily, her last, year, 8 months, something like that, has been an absolute whirlwind. And the humanitarian communities often have very specific needs that they need to address. And they also know what their needs are very well. So these tools were built first and foremost for the Red Cross. And we wanted to use everything that we had at hand, and we wanted to be able to do it we wanted to be able to reuse as much as possible, and we also wanted to do it in a sustainable way. But our primary users for this are, it's not the traditional historical OSM community, it's the emerging OSM community. It's the people that the Missing Maps effort is bringing into the project. And as a result, we are overly focused on their needs, but that's because that's where the Red Cross efforts are currently focused.
Hi there, my name is Andy, and I'm one of the developers of the core OpenStreetMap website software, and I also work for the OpenStreetMap Foundation Operations Working Group. What could we change that would make your life easier with POSSUM?
I think the first thing is a pull request that's sitting out there, which is to Dockerize it. For the most part, it's worked as is. I've had to make very strategic changes to bypass the user authentication because we don't have any way to verify identity. But everything else.
Would that be something that would be helpful? If
I
we
don't
could work
think
on
so. I think that it's such a niche need at the moment. I mean, we do want to solve the identity problem at some point, where we can actually get the authorship from people in the field and using their OSM accounts. That's a really, really, really hard problem, especially when you can't have person, internet, and password in the same, or person, internet, and device being authorized in the same place. But I think there are probably some clever solutions around that. No, I mean, it's been really great to work with. Yeah, and I think I've got a few changes that now that things are calming down that I'd like to submit back, that are things that I had to do kind of in the last throes of getting it ready. But no, I mean, it's actually been a wonderful project to work on, and yeah, everything has worked more or less as we've expected.
Okay, maybe a little bit technical question. Can you cover in a couple of words how do you actually synchronize it back? Simon already knows, but resolve these conflicts and everything.
Sure. So there's a more detailed blog post that talks through the process on hi.stamen.com. It's the Possum Replay Tool is the name of it. And once I get internet again, I'm going to update the Possum project on GitHub with it. The short to medium version is that we take all of the change sets that occur offline and treat them as Git commits. So we create a local Git repository so that we can simulate the conflicts that the OSM API would produce so that we don't have to trigger a conflict, figure out how to resolve it, trigger it again, figure out what the next problem is. By moving everything into the Git world, we can use all of the existing Git conflict resolution tools to determine what those conflicts are, and then to use the same tools to do the conflict resolution, where it'll pop up a text editor. In this case, we're using YAML to represent the nodes, ways, and relations as distinct files. So it'll track files that move, it'll track attributes that change within individual files. And then once the rebase has occurred against whatever the current version of OpenStreetMap is, we know that we've resolved those conflicts. And maybe we want to do it again to reduce the window. But again, we're working in areas that don't have a whole lot of heavy editing activity. So once we've done that initial pass at conflict resolution, we know that the likelihood of popping a conflict when we submit it to the API is pretty low. So at that point, we can start submitting those change sets up to the real OpenStreetMap API, and then take the identifiers that changed, because we're creating all sorts of new nodes. And I think that, actually, maybe this is a thing for Andy. If there were not a single source of identity generation for OpenStreetMap elements, that would be incredibly beneficial, because if we pull an extract that has IDs 1, 2, 3, and 4, and people edit and create new things on OpenStreetMap, they get 5, 6, 7, 8. And people are editing on Possum, they also get 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we have to track the differences there, and we have to keep track of which elements we created offline. And then when they get submitted to the OpenStreetMap API, they get assigned new identifiers, and we have to rewrite that through all of the local changes. So that was probably the biggest, most complicated part of that.
Yeah. Is it a big problem, really, or kind of setup?
It's got a lot of edge cases. I think that's the main part of it. That there are a lot of things that you need to make sure that you get right for it to work properly.
To reduce conflicts when you merge, is it desirable for armchair mappers outside your area to hold off from mapping your area? And is there a way of indicating that, for example, locking it on HotOSM's task manager?
That's a good idea, actually, but it's not something that I would want to encourage, because, I mean, we don't know how long these are going to be offline for, so we don't want to prevent edits from occurring elsewhere. I mean, that would be a good solution, but it's something that actually never crossed our mind, and I don't think it's something that we ever will do.
Yeah, in this area, we were less worried about it because I think we set an alert early on in the project for anyone doing editing in this massive area. Nobody was. So there was no need to lock it because we were the only people mapping.
Any more questions?